Welcome to the latest episode of First Word in Sport. Recording this Monday morning, joined by John. How are you doing this morning, John?
I'm doing very well, thank you, Luke. I was enjoying a bit of the championship this weekend. There's a little hors d'oeuvre for the main course next week, and yeah, nice reminder that we could have been in it. So I'm quite pleased we're not. How are you doing?
Yeah, not too bad. So originally we were hoping to do a Tottenham, Aston Villa, and Liverpool pod this morning. James has been unable to find a suitable location. That's the joys of having lots of young children in the house. So we will do a Liverpool one during the week at some stage. And then on Friday, the intention is to do a look at the Premier League season, really more from a betting perspective in terms of how we think, the top four, top 10, top six markets will look, relegation, next manager to leave, all those kinds of things. Community Shield yesterday, John. Arsenal notched up another major trophy under Arteta. Getting a little bit jealous on the other side of North London?
No, can't say I watched that one. I certainly would like to win the league. That'd be something I would be a little bit jealous of, but no, not especially jealous of winning the Charity Shield. Actually, one thing I did think about the Charity Shield, Spurs haven't been in it since.
Community Shield,
Community
John.
Shield. And I know they only changed it about 20 years ago, but yeah, we haven't been in it since 1991. I think Villa haven't been in it, I assume, since the early 80s. So I think it's a little bit like the Super Cup last week. I think it's one of those that is kind of meaningless, but it is actually nice to be in them because it shows you're doing something right.
So, I mean, the best part is you have to be good to be in the Super Cup. So Arsenal have never been in the Super Cup.
Is that right? I'm sure they've lost in it once.
I'm not sure. Who
Back
knows?
when the
But
Cup Winners'
I
Cup
think
used to get into it, didn't it? Back in the day.
I think the one big takeaway from yesterday's match would be overreactions and maybe not overreactions. I think, I'm always a little bit wary of drawing too much sort of information from, as you say, glorified preseason friendlies. But I think certainly not so much from an Arsenal perspective, because they are what we think they are, I think. But alarm bells have to be ringing at Manchester City with new manager Maresca. Rodri's transferred to Barcelona, now confirmed. They've lost the likes of Bernardo and Stones and, quite a lot of experience in there. And it, let's put it this way. I'm not sure I'd be rushing to be backing Manchester City to, you know, worry Arsenal too much this season.
Yeah, and when you've lost one of the greatest managers of all time, you're gonna expect that's gonna have some sort of negative effect, isn't it? But I guess my one reservation on taking that game too seriously, I think just more and more now in the modern game with sports science, teams really are just kind of easing their way through preseason. In particular, coming off a World Cup, right? I mean, I think everyone's just conscious you've got players that are tired. And you look at PSG, no better example. If you look at PSG in the Super Cup last year, they got outplayed by Spurs. Super Cup this year, outplayed by Aston Villa, and they lost at the weekend in the French whatever they call it, domestic Super Cup to Lens.
Yeah.
And so and this is PSG, might be one of the best club sides we've ever seen, kind of thing. And you see that from them in preseason, they're just miles off the levels because that's how they're managing their players. And so I do think when you start looking at friendlies and, it's not technically a friendly, it's sort of a semi-friendly, isn't it? The Community Shield. So I would have that in mind that you don't really know kind of how close to 100% everyone is trying. So it has moved the title odds for sure. It's knocked Arsenal down a couple of ticks. But I wouldn't go crazy about that scoreline.
I think that the Paris Saint-Germain stuff just quickly is interesting as much as I think the big difference between where they find themselves and, say, Manchester City is that I think in the Premier League, you have to be on it, not from the start necessarily. I know we've had years where Manchester City have sort of grown into the season, but I don't think you want to be making a really slow start in the Premier League. I know there's international breaks and everything else. Paris Saint-Germain can do nothing until Christmas and win that league at a canter, whereas you can't really do that in the Premier League. I think you have to be a little bit more switched on, should we say? It's that much harder in the Premier League from an earlier stage in the season.
No, you're absolutely right. And look, I mean, you look at all the other teams at the moment. Arsenal are the only ones that seem to have all their sort of ducks in a row. So it seems nicely set up for them to win it back to back. But I think what we've seen down the years, it's incredibly hard to win the Premier League back to back unless you are one of those teams that is having sort of a very dominant period, like Man United in the 90s, Chelsea after Abramovich took over, City after Abu Dhabi took over. Other than that, no one really wins it back to back, do they? So I think it is tough, and yeah, it'd be fascinating to see how it goes.
So the intention today is to talk about Tottenham and Aston Villa for the upcoming season. Obviously, we've both been fans of these clubs for best part of 40 years. We obviously watch every game, and really just give our insights into what we think has happened over last season, over the summer, how the squad is looking, some of the transfer business done, and really how we think that they're going to get on for the upcoming season. Um, and we'll start with Tottenham. 17th place finish, John. Lucky to survive and stay in the Premier League. And, the margins were incredibly thin, as always in the sport. And can we just, I'd hate to say it, back-to-back 17th place finishes. It's just, I know there's a lot of optimism in North London, John. Um, let's start with what your reflections are on last season. Having had a couple of months beyond, all the excitement. What are you thinking, looking back on what actually sort of transpired last season?
Yeah, I mean, just incredible. Worst season of my life. I mean, like literally, I'm in my mid 40s. I've never seen Spurs get relegated. They haven't been relegated since the 70s. And we've had a couple of relegation battles in the 90s. I don't think we would have ever gone like odds on for relegation in those. So yeah, this is the closest that it's ever been. And yeah, I mean, I do think one of my favorite parts of this season, and something that you should never forget, by the way, is that it was the win at Villa Park is the reason that Spurs stayed up. So whenever we hear Aston Villa fans complaining over the next few years about why are Tottenham allowed to spend all this money and all this stuff, I think you always just got to remember that if you just got a draw at home to Spurs in that game, you'd have Spurs in the Championship. We would have had to sell all sorts of our star players, and we wouldn't be spending all this money. So yeah, it's nice.
Sorry. Can I just clarify? You have some star players.
Well, I mean, relatively, we certainly would have had a lot of players. I think that other clubs would have come in for, like said Porro and Van der Ven and the rest. So, yeah, well, that's the unusual thing about last season, right? Is that Spurs actually, do have a decent squad relative to what a normal relegation side would be like, and even West Ham. I mean, that's the thing about West Ham is in the end, it wasn't really a story them going down because the big story was Spurs. But even them, I mean, it was a crazy squad of players to be getting relegated. So yeah, mad season all around.
I think the big thing, really, the big takeaway for me from last year about Spurs would have been the injuries. Now, you've had a couple of years where the injuries have been chronic, and I don't think you can really underestimate the impact that that has, particularly when you're losing certain positions in players in certain positions. So one of the things we always talk about offline is if you're losing three or four players in the same position, it really, really hinders you. I mean, the difference with Spurs last year, it was just throughout the whole team. The whole team was decimated with injuries. And, I know a lot of people, they go, oh, Tottenham had a few injuries. But the reality is you had a ridiculous number of injuries.
Yeah, I mean it's mad. I mean, you know how bad it is if you get like three or four midfielders out, for example. And you're talking about Spurs having like 13 players out injured at once and stuff. I mean, it's incredible, and there's just so many compounding effects of that as well because fans don't show up to games and go, "Ah, it's okay that we lost because we got injuries." Like people are paying 70, 80 quid to go to a match, and they're expecting them to play well. They're expecting them to win. So then the fans start getting on players' backs, confidence goes down, and It is just an absolute nightmare. And I think it's amazing how you look at your squad sometimes and you think, oh, we got good depth, we got 2 players in every position, and all this stuff. And especially when you're in Europe, which we're not this year, so we won't have that problem. But when you've got this sort of Champions League slog these days, where 8 matches in the group stage, like it only takes one injury to, let's say, a right back, and then all of a sudden the other right back, he's playing now 2 games a week, which puts an incredible load on his body, and it's quite easy for him to get injured. So it is sort of one of those things that once you start getting injuries, everyone else then has to play so many minutes that they then have more chance of getting injuries, and it can really just kind of spiral out of control.
So I think one of the positives for you would have been that Tottenham did make a decisive decision in terms of managers at the end. Obviously, managerially, last year was a disaster. I mean, it started so promisingly with Frank. Um, I mean, there was the great humour of Tudor, um, and then obviously acted decisively to get De Zerbi in. You've touched on before. At least he had a few games to see what he actually had at Tottenham. Probably learned a little bit about the character of players and the quality, and been able to make subsequent additions. What are you looking for from De Zerbi this year?
Yeah, I just think he's such a great fit for the club, to be honest with you. And yeah, I think it was a masterstroke really to bring someone in permanently, which I've mentioned before. And here is that everyone thought, oh, Spurs will just get another interim to keep them up, and then they'll probably go for Pochettino in the summer or something like that. And they didn't. They got De Zerbi in permanently, and I think it's got multiple advantages. I think from the player's perspective, maybe you did have the likes of Van der Ven thinking, oh, I want to get out of here. But if you've got a manager that has time to come in, the players can buy into his philosophy and everything. And I feel like some of the players do sort of want to play for him now. He's also had the chance to assess a lot of the squad, and I think it's fascinating to see which players are on the way out, because I think, when the likes of Spence and Romero and Vicario, some people are surprised maybe that didn't get huge fees for them, but I think evidently they're the players that he's decided to move on from. Um, One interesting thing I did hear about De Zerbi the other day, actually, which I think is really cool. He actually set up a dinner with lots of ex-players from the club. So, just all sorts of huge dinner players, from down the years, Gary Mabbott, Glenn Hoddle, and just getting them sort of just back involved, talking about the club and just the philosophy and everything. I think that's nice. I think all clubs should be doing a bit more of that, really, just sort of treating it like a family and giving them input on how things are run. And so I do think it's nice that when you've got a manager where it feels like everyone's singing from the same hymn sheet, whereas when we appointed Thomas Frank, for example, like from day one, I thought, I don't like this appointment, right? And I'm sure a big chunk of fans were similar. And it's just always that awkward situation. I know you've had it at Villa, right, where if half the fans aren't a big fan of the manager, it's almost like they're so quick then to get on the team's back when they don't play well. So I think it is important when you have just sort of buy-in from everyone involved.
It's interesting from an outsider's perspective. I think De Zerbi, one thing he doesn't do is mess around, right? So he's not afraid to make decisions. He's not afraid to ruffle a few feathers. He seems quite an abrasive character, and I always think short term that's great, particularly at someone like Spurs, where some difficult decisions need to be made. I think you can't finish back to back 17th and not think something serious has to change. So I think in that respect that someone like a De Zerbi is, as you say, is a great fit. The worry always would be going forward. You know, how does that look in 18 months' time? Maybe you're not bothered about 18 months' time. It's a case of just actually re-establishing yourselves as a top 6 or 7 team as you have been in previous years. Now, obviously, the injuries not being there will play a large part in that. But I'm thinking more in terms of De Zerbi, because one thing he doesn't really do is he doesn't play young players. So there's going to be a period of alienating youngsters, which I know you're not particularly bothered by. But I just wonder if at some point in, say, 18 months' time, the players, might grow tired of the way, he manages. Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, I think long term with managers these days, it's just so rare to actually have a manager for more than like 2 seasons max, right? So, not too fussed about that. Hopefully, what you get is just some oversight from the guys running the club, right? That if De Zerbi just wants to sell all the young players just so he can buy one superstar, then you'd like to think they would step in at that point. But yeah, generally, I think that we all get excited about developing young players, don't we? I think that's the dream. Like someone like Harry Kane, for example. I think when you get someone like him that comes through the youth team and ends up being an absolute superstar, that's what you're looking for. But I just remember down the years how many young players have got plenty of first team starts for Spurs. And in the end, you realize they're just absolutely useless. I think, I mentioned Oliver Skipp on here before. I saw that he was playing in League One at the weekend. I mean, that just shows you, right, the sort of levels. And there was one I remember years ago. There was a defender called Alton Thelwell. And I remember when he broke into the team. So when he first played, I decided I'd give him the nickname Alton Towers because Alton Towers, for those who aren't English, that's a sort of famous theme park in England. And then we saw we saw him play a couple of times, and my brother gave him the new nickname Faulty Towers because he was absolutely useless. And I just think that it's one of those human biases, right? That we remember the best youngsters that have come through our team over the last 30 or 40 years. But I bet if you and I sat down and went through all the Villa and Spurs players that had come through the youth team and played however many years, 20 games, 50 games, even 100 games for the first team. And then in the end, it's like, yeah, this guy's no good. They sell him. He ends up not even in the Premier League. There's just so many. And I do think that it's nice to have a few youth team players around, but, it's not a charity. Tottenham Hotspur can't be there just to be nice to youth team players and give them a path to professional football. I mean, they can have a path to professional football elsewhere. And I've heard that Spurs are actually pretty good with their young players when they leave. They really help them out. I've heard that they'll sort of drive them to trials and help them out with their next move and stuff. And really, I think that for a lot of young players, they just want to be professionals. And yeah, I'm sure they want to play for Spurs, but I think they just want to play professional football. And so it's not something that bothers me too much if it's difficult to get into the Spurs first team, because it bloody should be. We're one of the top 10 teams in the world in terms of revenue. It should be incredibly hard to get into that first 11.
I'm just glad you added the word revenue then to that to that statement. Okay, let's talk transfers, because it feels like the owners, there's obviously been a few ownership changes in the last 12, 18 months at Tottenham with Levy out. And I guess the general perception is that the purse strings have been opened up a little bit, whether that be from a transfer perspective. I mean, you have spent a lot of money in recent years on transfers, it should be said. But it hasn't always been accompanied by a comparable wage bill in terms of there's such strong correlation between wage bill and success in the Premier League, far more than, say, transfers. And, there's always been the accusation at Spurs, and well, certainly in recent times, that, they're not spending the money on the wages to get the players that they need. It feels like this summer's been a little bit different, John. Talk to me about, let's go transfers in first, because that's a bit more glamorous than transfers out. But let's talk through some of your big transfers. I mean, I guess let's start with, Tonali. I mean, it was a bit of a surprise he came to Spurs, I think, in the end. Big money, big wages, big presence, I think, would be the way I think about him.
Yeah, I'm just so happy about this one. When it's one of those, when the rumors began, you're just so conditioned to thinking, well, this is just not going to happen, right? And then Man City get involved, and you think, yeah, there you go. And so I think you just expect that he'll end up going to Man City. And so when we got it over the line, I mean, I was absolutely thrilled. It's obviously big money, right? So you're expecting him to be quite good, but I just think that we talk about the floor of a player, and I just think his floor is so high. I think you're buying a player where you basically know now, unless he gets a serious injury, which there's a good chance at Spurs, but no, unless he gets a serious injury or something, you'd be pretty sure that you've locked down that central midfield spot for maybe 5 years now. And I think the leadership and character experience is just something that's needed. And yeah, it just feels like a very, very safe bet. You know, what I like about him is that not only this is a big money transfer, but he was a big money transfer when he joined Newcastle. And I always think that's a decent indicator. You know, we've mentioned how some players' values just rocket within 1 year, and that's always like a little bit of a red flag. But, you know, this guy was 50, 60 million 3 years ago when he joined Newcastle. So I think that makes it a lot safer bet. You know, he's started for AC Milan prior to that. And I just feel really, really good about this one. It's exactly what we needed.
Fernandez on a different scale, so not too dissimilar sort of price tag. I suspect the wages, whilst big, aren't comparable. Different sort of age, different profile in terms of a lot younger. And talk about floor. I mean, the floor is a lot lower with Fernandez because we just don't know. You know, despite having played 2 years of Premier League football for Southampton and then obviously West Ham, there's still so many question marks about him as a player. It's one of those ones where you look at it from an eye test at times and he looks really, really good. But he has also been part of a team that's been relegated successive years. So it feels like a few more question marks about Fernandez.
Yeah, I think what I'd say about Fernandez, because we talked about him at the back end of last season, and I said I had reservations for the fees being talked. So I'm not going to suddenly change my mind about that because he went to
Mm.
Spurs. What I will say, I'm glad that we signed Tonali and Fernandez. I think if we'd have just signed Fernandez for 85 million, I'd be a lot more skeptical. But I think getting the two of them together, just because Tonali, the style of player he is, does so much work defensively off the ball, and I think maybe that will be required because that's one of my reservations about Fernandez. When you look at how bad West Ham's defense was, I think when you're playing him just as more of a central midfielder, as an eight, as they call it these days, whether he's got enough of a defensive game to get away with that, I still don't know. Haven't watched enough of West Ham, so I'll probably be able to tell you after a few months this season a little bit more accurately. But a little bit like his namesake, actually, Bruno Fernandes up at Man United. You know, when you think that he was playing centrally in a midfield four under Amorim, and they were pretty entertaining, but defensively very suspect, weren't they? And that was one of the biggest changes that Carrick made, moving Bruno further forward, because then you don't really need sort of anyone else doing his running for him because he doesn't have as much defensive responsibility. So that would be my concern with Fernandes. He has previously played as more of an attacking midfielder, and he dropped deeper at West Ham, playing more like a sort of playmaker. And so um, whether he's got the defensive game to do that, I don't know. I guess we'll find out. But yeah, it's just exciting that the club, when you're competing with Man United for a player like that, because Man United clearly wanted him, and instead of and under Daniel Levy, it would have been a lot of kind of lowballing and then going, "Oh no, this is too high for us." They said, "Do you know what? This is a player the manager wants. We're just going to get it done." And yeah, time will tell. Maybe they'll look like a genius move or a stupid move. I don't know, but honestly, I'm pretty happy with it.
Well, I think if nothing else, he is only 21. So it certainly gives scope for improvement. Um, it also means that if he's a disaster, you'll find some team. I was thinking like a West Ham who will pay 40, 50 million for him to bail you out anyway. Um, but I think what's interesting about those two signings is that central midfield has clearly been a big weakness for Tottenham, and that certainly addresses that. I mean, we can come and touch on that midfield a little bit later when talking about Tottenham. Van Hecke, I just want to say one thing about Spurs is the transfer business, a lot of it done very early in the window. As a fan, always love to see that. I hate this situation where you're a week from season starting and you've got 4 holes you need to fill and you've ended up playing 3 games with the transfer window still being open. You know, all the speculation that continues on. It doesn't help anyone. So I think there's one thing I would say about Spurs is, you know, they've not been afraid to spend the money and they've done a good business early on. So Van Hecke would be another one. You know, excited,
Well,
John?
I think what's interesting about we'll take Van Hecke and Senesi as a pair. Obviously, a little bit different in terms of fees because Senesi was a free transfer, Van Hecke with 52 million. But I think what's fascinating is if you look at the stats last season for the number of line breaking passes in the Premier League, numbers 1 and 2 in the whole league were Van Hecke and Senesi, and Spurs have gone out and signed them. So that's a pretty clear indication of one of the areas where they felt they really had to improve. Number 3 was Elliot Anderson, by the way, in that list. So I think it's when De Zerbi came in, he openly talked about, we're just going to keep it simple. This isn't the time for trying to train them in new elaborate schemes or anything. But I think you might start to see more of the De Zerbi sort of fingerprint on this team now with the build up from the back and all that kind of stuff. Defensively, how good they are, I don't know. I mean, Van Hecke, I thought he looked all right at the World Cup. I think it's the sort of thing where hopefully you can get that partnership going with Van der Ven. I mean, for years we had Alderweireld and Vertonghen, which, you had 2 players from the same country that sort of had a good rapport on the pitch. You're hoping that they can recreate something like that because apparently Van der Ven and Van Hecke, they actually played together for the Holland under-21s years ago, so they've actually been friends for quite a long time, and so yeah, hopefully that's a partnership that can get going, and I certainly think you're going to see a little bit more sort of entertaining football this year with the build up from the back, because the build up from the back was calamitous last year. We couldn't even get it across the halfway line when we're sort of 1-0 down chasing an equalizer. It was unbelievable. So yeah, I'm hoping that is going to be a big area of improvement.
Andy Robertson at left back, obviously a very experienced campaigner. I know James thinks he's been past his best for about 3 or 4 years. I tend to be more in James's camp than this being some amazing signing, if I'm honest. He does look a little bit washed up. But sometimes a bit of experience on a free transfer, what's the downside? If you're not too worried about wages and everything else, he certainly seems like the right sort of character, I would say, in the dressing room.
Yeah, and I think that's clearly the idea, right? I think they're trying to bring in good characters, good leaders, experience, a little bit like what Chelsea are doing, signing Henderson and Welbeck. I feel like Robertson's going to play more of a first team role than people expect. I know some people have said like, oh, they're just buying him as cover for Udogie or whatever. I think he's going to be the starting left back from day one, to be honest with you. And I think the hope is that you've got a player who's got a little bit of a chip on his shoulder now, right? Liverpool have let him go. He's probably seen Kirkes come into Liverpool and thought, this fella's useless, and they're letting me go so they can play him. So yeah, I think the downside of this is that apparently it's a 4-year contract, which, he might be good this year, maybe even next year, but you start getting towards like 36 years old. And if you're paying him, I mean, I don't know what he's on, but it must be a good chunk, right, as a free transfer. So yeah, it's one of those deals that could start looking pretty bad in a couple of years' time. But yeah, I do think you have to consider intangibles in football. And from a Liverpool point of view, yeah, I get it, right? They're way higher than us in the table. And they've decided they've got to move on and get younger. I think there's just different needs at Spurs. Actually, I think our squad is okay. I think there's young talent. There's just a massive lack of character and leadership. And so, yeah, it's almost like signed as a kind of like a player coach type thing, it feels like. So, yeah, I'm okay with it, with reservations further down the line, I'd say.
So I see Dubravka's been brought in as well I think that's a really good backup goalkeeper you have there, by the way. He was okay at Burnley last year. I think he could do a lot worse. It's sometimes those small little transfers like that actually, if you have injuries in certain positions, which really make a difference in terms of, you think you've had likes of Forster and, oh my word, you've had some pretty special backup keepers in recent times.
Yeah, it's a tough position to fill, isn't it? Backup goalkeeper, because you're basically not going to play. And they always give him League Cup matches and stuff, don't they? And it's hard. And yeah, when we had Fraser Forster, I mean, goodness me, that fella was so far off what level you should be at as a Premier League goalkeeper. And of course, the weird thing is, well, you get away with it a lot of the time, don't you? If your first choice goalkeeper just doesn't get injured, which is quite common, and then you're okay. You can have me on the bench as the backup goalkeeper. But the problem is, I think when Vicario he got a 3 month injury or whatever it was. This is not last year, the year before, and then you end up that forced us coming in having to play every match. It was absolutely shambolic. So yeah, I think you can't complain about that. As the Dubravka as your backup goalkeeper, I think is that's pretty solid.
Yeah, definitely think a good option. Okay, let's talk about some of the outgoings. Obviously, the big ones are obviously likes of your Romero's. Obviously, a huge presence within the club, but we've talked about his shortcomings at other various times. I think the only shame for Spurs would be is when fit, when he's not being a clown, he is a very good centre back. So I think one of the problems when I look at Spurs, and we can come on to this shortly, but the last couple of years on an individual basis, you've obviously had Vicario, you've had Porro or Spence, you've had Udogi, you've had Van der Ven, Romero, and on paper, it's looked what should be an elite sort of defensive unit, and it hasn't played anywhere near that. And I think what's been really interesting is obviously you've got rid of Romero, Spence has gone to Inter Milan. Vicario looks like he's going to Juventus. That is all the talk this morning. It looks like a loan. Whether there's an obligation to buy him there or not, I don't think so. So you might have the Vicario issue again next year. It looks like De Zerbi. I mean, things like Romero, I think it was inevitable that he was going to leave. And then you've also got rid of a couple of youngsters in terms of obviously Vuskovic has gone for big money, but he never played for Spurs. It's one of those weird transfers that I never mind too much. You have a youngster who has been very highly touted, and you've got a massive fee for him, even though he's never been anywhere near the Tottenham first team really. And then obviously you've had other youngsters. There's definitely been a push to sell some of your other youngsters. I see Lankshire's gone to Middlesbrough. He scored a couple of times over the weekend. And then even the fringe players like Phillips and Feliz, have all departed. What are your thoughts in terms of the departures, John?
Well, I think it's the flip side of what you said earlier about Spurs done well to get players in early. The flip side of that is it does weaken your position a little bit because it's pretty obvious then that you've got like too many centre backs and that Romero's going to go, too many fullbacks and that Spencer's going to go. So yeah, I mean, I just think you can't have it both ways, right? I think that if you wanted to get the absolute maximum for Romero, then you would pretend like he was going to be in the first team. You'd play him in the preseason friendlies, and then you'd squeeze as much money as you can in August, and then you'd bring in Van Hecker at the last minute. And that's probably the sort of thing Daniel Levy would do. And he would pat himself on the back thinking, "No, I've got an extra 5-10 million in the bank for that." And I don't want to knock that too much, because the fact is you can't just be cavalier with money where it's 5 million here, 10 million there. Like it does add up. But I do think that there probably is quite a positive effect of just having players in early and getting getting them into preseason training and stuff. So yeah, Romero. Yeah, I think when you're talking about your dressing room leaders are so important, and there's a sense that he just was never sort of fully invested in things, and it reminds you a little bit of Arsenal when about a decade ago, around the time Emery was there. And you're talking about like sort of Aubameyang was the probably like the main player, and I always just think like it's so important when you go into that dressing room. I think there is a sense among the players, regardless of who's the captain or whatever. There's a sense of like who are the senior players, and I think it's really important. I think they set the tone for everything, and so yeah, I'm hopefully just sort of moving him on, and then having the likes of Tonali, Van der Ven will be stepping up as more of a leader. Hopefully, they can just get a little bit more of a sort of serious culture going.
Do you think Romero thought or think that he was too big for Tottenham?
Yes, yeah, I think so. Because especially with Argentina being so good at the moment, they're winning all sorts, and he's brilliant for Argentina. Whenever you watch him, they've got such a good defense, and he's right at the heart of it. He made it, a lot of, well, sort of multiple public comments criticizing the club, which I mean, I'm not fully against. I think like a lot of the things he was criticizing was the fact that they were not willing to invest money. He was always complimentary about the club. It was more sort of criticizing the ownership of not being ambitious enough or whatever, which is a sentiment a lot of fans share, I think. But yeah, I think it's just evident the fact that De Zerbi has praised Van de Ven to the hilt. They've given him a new contract while Romero's been moved on. You know, I think that speaks volumes, to be honest. A couple of the youngsters that you mentioned, so two of them have gone to Middlesbrough. Uh, Lancashire, he scored the winner in the League Cup for them, and then he scored both goals at the weekend. So he's going to be fascinating to watch. He's only 21. But the other one, Phillips, I think is quite interesting because he was starting every match last season at age 20 as a centre back. And really, we've talked before about how the Championship can be a really sort of good recruiting ground now for Premier League teams. And so I think it's kind of interesting that we didn't get a little bit more for Ashley Phillips. So I think it'll be interesting to watch him, see how his career goes. But Middlesbrough as well, I mentioned in one of my Substack pieces that I feel like they could be reasonable value at 10-1 to win the Championship. They've signed a few players now, and they were pretty good last year. So I'll be keeping an eye on them as well. And thankfully, we're not playing them this season in the league.
I think just the only other thing I'd touch on would be losing Spence's versatility. Whilst I never got the impression he's good enough to start at either fullback position, I always thought he was very useful to have and that he could actually play on either side.
I agree.
But
I agree. But I think also, what's the best Jed Spence has ever been in his career, right? I mean, he's come in and played because of all the injuries we've had at Spurs. And then obviously he was surprisingly included in the Cup squad this year, right? I don't think a lot of people weren't really expecting that in advance. And then he had a couple of decent games. He also had a ropey game against Ghana. It does feel like the Jed Spence stock is as high as it's ever been. And he's got sort of questions from his past over attitude and stuff, which, it's not necessarily fair to always tar him with that brush. But yeah, again, I just think De Zerbi's come in and he's sanctioned that move. And I think if he loved Jed Spence, then he would have kept him around.
let's talk goalkeepers. Let's talk about the sort of different areas of the team. From an outsider's perspective, Kinski recovered remarkably well at the back end of last season after the Atletico Madrid. You'd never have believed after the Atletico Madrid game that, we'd be here with him being new contract, your number one goalkeeper. Vicario looking likely to be shipped off to Juventus. I think it fascinates me because this has potential to be a real weak spot for you. I think, when you look throughout the team, there's a lot of question marks here. We don't really know how good Kinski truly is. How are you feeling in terms of what's happening in the goalkeeping position?
Yeah, I totally agree with you, to be honest. I think the jury is still massively out on Kinski. And it's where, if anyone starts getting optimistic about this season, it's an area where it just sort of keeps your feet on the ground. Because the fact is, we don't really know how good this kid is. He made a couple of cracking saves at the back end of last season. And it was a great story, right? That he played a crucial role in keeping Spurs up after what had happened over in Madrid. But, if you just think objectively, the Czech Republic played at the World Cup and they took 3 goalkeepers, and Kinski was not one of those 3 goalkeepers. So just from an objective point of view, he was not considered one of the best 3 Czech goalkeepers just a couple of months ago. One of them was actually the fella Newcastle have signed. I think he was the second or third choice goalkeeper. Hornacek was one of them. But yeah, that just shows you. And I think the good thing is he's clearly, ironically, after what happened in Madrid, he is actually good with the ball at his feet. I think it was just a mental slippy pitch, to be honest, over in Madrid. But I think that's one good thing. So it sort of reminds me of like that first year of Guardiola at Man City. Do you remember when he brought in Bravo, who was useless, but he could play with the ball at his feet? And so I think if nothing else, at least you're going to be able to instill the kind of De Zerbi style. And then I think if we find out then that maybe he's not consistent enough with his shot stopping and other parts of the game, then you may find then that Spurs are moving on again in a 12 months or 2 years or whatever, trying to get another new keeper. Or maybe he'll be really good. I mean, we don't know, right? But it is certainly an unknown area, I'd say, for us.
Well, I think if nothing else, the fact you've moved on from Vicario is, for me, a real positive because I was never his biggest fan. I didn't think he was that good. There were lots of it's almost that Jordan Pickford-esque situation where you see a shot in the middle of the goal, the keeper's flailing, got nowhere near it, and you go, it doesn't necessarily always go down as an error against the goalkeeper, but for someone who wasn't small, Vicario always seemed to play as a relatively small goalkeeper. And then obviously at various times there were issues. And I think he was a bit unfortunate with some of the stuff that happened at set pieces. And,
Yeah, I think I will
and I
say
think
that. I think he's unlucky that crosses evidently, I think, were the weakest part of his game. And then he's come to England exactly at the time where they started doing all the wrestling and blocking from set pieces. And I think also sometimes reputation then goes before you. So it's like referees know, oh, this fella's dodgy on set pieces. And he would just get fouled so badly. I remember there was one at Everton where the Everton player literally was like barging him into the goal mat, like across the line. And they let it go. And it's just, I don't think that helped him, to be honest with you.
I, I, I always love that because the commentators just go, "Oh, he needs to be stronger,
Oh.
John. He needs to be stronger." So I think goalkeeper potentially weakness. Obviously, defense. You spend a lot of money, in terms of bringing in. Obviously, as we talked about, Robertson, Van Hecke, and Senesi. Where do you see things happening in terms of, as I say, that defensive unit, big new contracts with Van der Ven and Porro, on paper, it should be a top 6-7 defense in the league. The worry would be is that you have a lot of players there who aren't brilliant defenders. That would be my big criticism of Van Hecke and even Senesi as well. They are both very good with the ball at the feet, but defensively, I think there's question marks about both. And, I'm not a massive Van Hecke fan. I've always thought he's a little bit overrated, but it's going to be interesting to see whether, playing alongside a Van der Ven covers up those deficiencies.
Yeah, well, throw Pedro Porro into that as well in terms of player who's fantastic on the ball and a bit ropey defensively. So I think as a unit, that's what I would say is that it could be a lot better on the ball than off it. But yeah, I mean, one thing to watch actually with the Spurs defense, certainly for the opening game that's coming up at least, Van der Ven actually didn't play a single minute in the whole of preseason. Now, there's no sort of announcement that he's injured or anything like that. So I don't think it's a case of like, oh, wow, he might be out for ages. I think Spurs are just incredibly cautious, understandably, after how the last couple of years have gone. So I think if Van der Ven coming back from the World Cup, if there was any sort of little knock or anything like that, I think they've just decided, look, wrap him up in cotton wool. So I would actually expect, I think Senesi might start that opening game. Pedro Porro only arrived back in training on Thursday, I believe, after he obviously won the World Cup. So he was there longer than anybody. And so, again, I wouldn't be surprised if Archie Gray starts at right back in the first match. So anyone that's looking to get a bit of money down in that first game and thinking, oh, my God, I'm going to pile on Spurs because they've made all these signings and whatever, just be aware that I think that's going to be a tough match. I think Spurs are not really sort of up to 100%. And you're playing against the Brentford team, they'll just be ready to go, right? It'll just be run out the same thing that they do every year. So something to be aware of.
So midfield, touched on it. I thought it was a real weakness, an area of real weakness for Tottenham last year in terms of particularly in those central midfield areas. It feels like it's been addressed somewhat. You can't do any more than two massive signings in the central midfield areas, really. Still question marks in terms of uh, exactly how things look. I think it's always difficult. So in terms of your sort of holding midfielders and central midfielders, it looks like you're set now for a while. There's obviously a lot of question marks in terms of further forward, in terms of the wide players, exactly how De Zerbi sees things. Um, Obviously, things like the injuries, you know, any how long are we expecting Simons to be out for?
Well, it's ACL, and he got injured right at the back end of last season, wasn't it, at Wolves? So he won't be playing before Christmas. Um, Odebear, he did his ACL, I think it was like, was it January, something like that?
Yeah,
So I'd expect, towards the end of the calendar year, you might see Odebear coming back. Kulusevski is one of those where you'll be glad if he plays football again, because apparently he's had an absolute nightmare. Kudus, he got injured in the first week of January, which was only a muscle injury, and wasn't even supposed to be out long term, but it ended up he had setbacks, missed the whole of the season, and he's still not fit. He's not ready to go now, so he's going to miss the start of the season as well. And this is one of the
just just
problems
just quick,
with the.
just quickly on Kudus is it does strike me as if there might be something more at play because I struggle for such an innocuous. I'm not look. It just from an outsider's perspective, it just seems weird that you have a player like Kudus. It was an innocuous injury, and it's almost. I'm not going to say it's the same as Kulusevski in terms of when he got injured, it wasn't like some disastrous injury, and then you know next thing you know is it's another 6 weeks, another and it's just gone on and on and on and on. And the Kudus one, it just seems it was such an innocuous injury that you're now looking 8 months down the line, he hasn't been playing football. You'd been almost quicker coming back if he'd actually had an ACL or something. I mean, it just seems crazy. And I did see one interesting thing that with De Zerbi tried to sign Kudus when he was at Brighton.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I don't know what the full
So
story
he
is.
he clearly likes him.
I think, again, it could just be an abundance of caution. I mean, he obviously did have setbacks last season. Otherwise, I mean, we needed him desperately. Missed him so much. I mean, as an outlet on that right hand side, he's so strong that you're able to play the ball up to him, and he can sort of keep hold of it. Once he got injured, was I think when Spurs' season really started going pear shaped. To be honest with you. Not least because we don't have any other right-sided attackers, and that's a problem we've still got now, which is why you're seeing the Savinho links drag on and on and on and on. So I think, you know, I mentioned doubts at goalkeeper, but certainly these wide attacking midfield, forward positions, we're so thin because we've got these injuries. And again, this is a knock-on effect of injuries. What do you do? Do you go out and spend a load of money getting new players while you're waiting for Xavi Simons to come back and Odegaard to come back and Kudus to come back? And then they all come back, and then suddenly you've got a load of players. But it's very difficult to make these decisions. But right now, I mean, we played a friendly on Saturday, and it was Matisse Tell on the left and Mikey Moore on the right. And so, unless Spurs sign anyone else, that's going to be your starting wingers going into the opening day. So, I think you probably will see a lot of movement this week in terms of transfers. And I think Savinho and Gakpo have been linked. I think probably they will happen, certainly at least one. And again, it's like, are they ideal signings, the dream signings from my point of view? No, but we desperately need bodies in. And so it's like, as a fan, you'll always kind of take it, right?
So that striker situation isn't ideal, is it? Obviously Solanke, Richarlison, there's a real lack of quality there. I mean, and it's not like you didn't spend big money on both either. I guess that's the thing when we touched on the goalkeeper area, and it's so hard to buy it. There's been so much talk about Savinho, Gakpo. I still don't think they necessarily. I think one of the worries when you look at the balance of the Spurs squad is, let's say you sign both of them, is they're not strikers. You also need a proper striker, and I I don't get the impression that you have anyone in mind that you really want as that new number 9.
Yeah, but I don't mind, to be honest, going into a season with these two. I think if they can strengthen the wide forward positions, I still think that, Solanke and Richarlison, they're nothing special, but I think they're good enough to be Premier League centre forwards. And again, you're right. They did spend good money on both of them. And it's almost identical in both cases that you had players that had a squeaky clean injury record, just been absolute warriors, Everton and Bournemouth, never hardly ever missed a game. And then they come to Spurs and they're just getting injured all the time. And it's, you know, it just affects everything when you spend a lot of money on players and they just get injured and hardly play, and then people go, oh, the recruitment's been terrible. And it's like, well, I think if Richarlison had come in and just not had all those injury problems at Spurs, who knows how good he would have been. And I still, do you know what? I still got a sneaking suspicion that Richarlison, he could have a good season at some point if he can stay fit. Solanke, I think, does have a few lingering injuries, and he's bang average, to be honest. Solanke. I mean, I said when we signed him, I said, oh, "What are we doing here?" But I think he's one of those players. He does put in a lot of work off the ball, and so I think that he can maybe make other players look good with the work he puts in. But yeah, I think overall, neither of these two are amazing, and I'm sure if we don't replace them this summer, that'll probably be a position where you look at Spurs spending a lot of money next summer. But overall, I think if we can just provide more depth in the attacking mid area, then I'm still okay. I think with having these two number nines.
It's probably speed things up a little bit. Youngster to watch quickly for this year coming up.
Well, there's Mikey
Have
Moore,
you got any
who's probably going out
left?
on loan. He looks pretty good. Youngster called Luca Williams Barnett, who he's 17, cheeky winger. I think what was great was in preseason, one of the games went to penalties. He took the first penalty and he did a Panenka and scored it. So he's not short of confidence. I think, as with all youngsters, you just got to accept that the chance of them actually realizing that potential and becoming superstars is always lower than you think. But yeah, I'd say Moore and Williams Barnett are the two to watch at Spurs.
I think Williams Barnett's interesting. I did see a preseason clip of him and he looked unbelievable. So we will see how long or if he makes it. So let's just round things up with Tottenham. Expectations for the season. The Obviously the spread betting companies, it's always an interesting way to look at things. They have you finishing sixth, ahead of teams like obviously Villa, Newcastle, which if you'd asked me at the end of last season would have felt a push. But I think on the basis of everything that's happened, I think it's fair enough. You've got two teams who have been decimated, and you have, Tottenham who have spent big money, and there's a bit of a feel-good factor, I think, around Tottenham at the moment. What are your expectations?
Yeah, I think you gotta always think how bad we were last year, and in terms of betting, I think if you oppose these types of moves in markets where you get a team that was really bad and they sign a couple of players and everyone thinks, oh my God, they might get into the Champions League, I think generally you oppose those types of moves, right? So I'm just sort of trying to stay realistic. I think I'd like to think we'll be in the top half and maybe pushing for European spots. But I wouldn't expect everything to change overnight. There's some real problems in the team that will take a little bit of time to sort out. One thing that I am hopeful for this year is some strong runs in the domestic cups, because we've just been so bad in the domestic cups for the last sort of 10, 15 years. I think so much of the energy from the club has gone into like trying to qualify for the Champions League every season or trying to avoid relegation last year. But I do think that this is where having the low wage bill doesn't help. I think if you look at who wins a lot of the domestic cups, it is the teams with massive wage bills. They just hoover them up because it's so hard to challenge on multiple fronts. So I think this year with no Europe, there's really no excuse, and that was something I think that annoyed the fans about Ange in his first season. We'd had a good start. We had no Europe that year, which it is quite rare for Spurs to have no Europe. And then we went to Fulham in a League Cup match, and he just made wholesale changes. We were rubbish, and we lost on penalties. And I think that you do have to recognise that there are times where if you don't have Europe, you got to say, look, this is a really good chance to just go all out for a domestic cup. So I think that would be, I would hope this year, good football, improvements. You want to see the new signings doing well because that's going to be, a big part of how well the future goes, and challenge for the domestic cups, I'd say.
So I always think with this is thing with expectations is always a tricky one, but I always like to go through expectations start of a season because as the season progresses, it's very easy to lose sort of some perspective at times. Things sometimes get better than you expect, sometimes worse. But given all the resources available, I don't think there can be any excuses. With no Europe, you spend a lot of money strengthening certain areas. Tottenham should be challenging for European football. There's no question in my mind, given everything else that's happening in the league as well, all the other new managers and just a general, it feels like chaos, to be honest. It feels like an unbelievable opportunity for Spurs to put together a really good season.
Yeah, I remember saying to you 12 months ago that it was just such a range of possibilities of what you might get from Spurs, because of the horrendous injuries they'd had the year before. And of course, well, we just got the horrendous injuries again. So you just don't know. I think that's just keeps you in check when you've been through this experience of the last couple of years where you're getting 12 or 13 players out at the same time. Like, well, if that happens again, we're not qualifying for Europe. You know what I mean? So I think it's just it's really hard to predict. Maybe it's someone else's turn this time. Maybe we'll have a year like Man United last year where they had almost no injuries, no Europe, and you're able to kind of start and put a few results together. But yeah, I think that's the only good thing about finishing 17th is it does just set such a low bar that I think any moderately good season will get a bit of a feel good factor of the club moving in the right direction. So let's hope that we've hit our lowest point and we're on an upward trend from now on.
Well, I think that's enough talking about the 17th place team from last year.
Yeah, well,
Um,
let me take over then because we're going to talk about Villa. So we'll start off by recapping last season. So finished fourth. I mean, honestly, this is maybe the best Aston Villa team of your lifetime. I know you've won the league and European Cup when you were a baby, and yeah, you've had good runs in the 90s. You had a couple of good teams, and then a good run under O'Neill, finishing sort of sixth. But I think in terms of a 3 or 4 year stretch of high finishes, you'd say probably this is the best team you've ever seen.
I think so. Certainly in those sort of late 80s, early 90s, obviously finished second in the league a couple of times. Obviously won, a couple of cups, but they were like Carabao Cup, effectively league cups at the time. I, I just don't think you can underestimate the job Emery has done. And, everything that's happening around the club at the moment in terms of the chaos. It all comes back to me as the fact that we have Emery in charge, and you just have to have almost blind faith at this point that he will sort it out. He came into Villa 4 years ago, taking over Gerrard, absolute shambles. We were in the relegation, effectively in the relegation zone, and he got us into Europe that year. He's got us into Europe every year. I mean, it's incredible given how I know you and James have slightly different opinions on the whole financial restrictions. Obviously a lot less sympathetic than some teams will be, like some fans. But Villa are so hamstrung by what's happening financially. For him to be able to sell our best players at various points through that 4 year period and to come up with something competitive. Like Villa spent basically nothing last summer. Every other team up there spent 150, 200 million pounds on new players. And they still managed to finish, fourth. And in the end, it was relatively comfortable finishing in the Champions League. It wasn't like the year before where Champions League was going down to the last day. Should have got that against that United team as well. What Emery's done just feels incredible. And as a fan, this might be as good as it gets. Winning Europa League last year, it feels almost as if that was the end of an era because that team has, let's be really clear, that team did unbelievably well last year. That team has been decimated this summer. And I think Newcastle are facing the same problem. And this is where the financial restrictions really come into play. Is Villa had gone down a different route to other teams. They'd bought older players. They were spending the money on wages rather than transfers at times. But Villa had a massively aging squad. I think they had the second oldest team. I think the average age was 28 and a half. Only Everton, or maybe 28, only Everton had an older squad. And that's why you're seeing Villa now. And I think my one hope is that they go the whole hog. And, if Konza wants to go, he's only got 2 years left on his contract, get rid of him. Get rid of the older players. And, if there's a year or two of transition, so be it.
Yeah, I mean, so in terms of the financial restrictions, so my view on it is when you look at Aston Villa, right? Villa were in a really bad place. They were in the bottom half of the championship. It's no exaggeration to say that their next move may have been down rather than up, the way they were going under Randy Lerner. Like, honestly, it wouldn't have been a massive surprise if 2 years later they'd have ended up in League One. They were in awful shape. New owners have come in, gotten promoted, and to be honest, probably got promoted a year too early because that team that came up was absolutely horrific. So they had to spend a lot of money overhauling that squad just to sort of scrape up, in 17th. Continued to invest a lot of money in the squad. I mean, Gerrard came in as manager, didn't he? Didn't really work out. And, but Emery's come in. So they've had 2 Champions League qualifications. Probably should have been 3, like you mentioned. They really blew it against Man United a couple of years ago. I just think it's a great example that the restrictions don't stop teams from making enormous improvements. You go from the bottom half of the championship to multiple Champions League qualifications. And I do think that it's more interesting to me that it's challenging for teams to find a way to build a squad with some sort of limit on how much they can spend. I mean, if you think of Newcastle, right, with the Saudis coming in, if they'd have been literally just able to spend Abramovich type money, where you're talking about 2 billion on players, and then Newcastle are just winning the league every year, I just don't think that's especially interesting. And I think the good thing from the Villa perspective is I feel like their owners are more invested, and the things they're doing off the pitch in terms of developing the stadium and stuff, which is what you need to do, right? You need to build up the club. You need to build up revenues. I think you've got good owners that are trying to do that. And, Villa maybe at one point will become part of like a big seven. But it will take time. And I just don't have a massive problem with that. I don't think that teams should be able to just transform
I think,
overnight.
right. So the issue is this, right? Is you have teams like Man United who have been able to spend literally billions of pounds in the last, say, 5 years. Not £200 million every year without any consequence whatsoever in terms of their future spending. Where the club's at. And the problem, Newcastle and Villa, and Newcastle is always a bad example because they spent so badly last summer that there's so much more jeopardy on the transfers that the teams below make. We've always talked about transfers where it's very difficult to have a high hit rate with transfers. It feels these days more transfers fail than are actually what you deem a success. And the problem is when your Villas and Newcastles or any team trying to challenge is you're being asked to be so much more accurate and have in terms of success rate. So one of the things with, say, Villa, for example, is they've been very fortunate that they have had 2 huge home runs effectively in these last 2 or 3 years with Duran and Rodgers, where and even Grealish before that, you basically had 3 players there who they've sold for best part of £300 million between the 3 of them. And without those players, things would have looked incredibly different. It feels like they've been fortunate that the timing came along when it did. But there's no getting away from it that, the restrictions Villa have had in place effectively because of European settlements, because of financial fair play. The money, the club, I think where it gets frustrating is the owners have the money. I'm not saying they want to pump in literally billions and billions in the way that Newcastle were, but it does leave a sour taste when, you're being forced to sell your best players continually to try and balance the books. And you see other teams who spend pretty recklessly and there's no consequence to it. It just doesn't feel like a particularly fair playing field.
Yeah, but football's always been like that, though. I mean, you look at Man United back in the 80s, they were useless back when they had, Big Ron and stuff, but they'd always spend a lot of money every year and it didn't work. And then they'd try and buy someone else. And, you look at Liverpool in the 90s, they were always splashing money around. Spurs have always been splashing money around. I think it's always been like that.
Yeah,
And
but the difference is it's basically an artificial barrier
yeah,
that is stopping Villa being able to spend that's been created, by the bigger teams. They're basically, and it's difficult because you don't want to spend the whole time talking about Villa, just talking about this, but it's important because when you're looking at why Villa are having to completely reshape this summer and why they have lost so many players, it's because of all the restrictions that they've had in the last 3 or 4 years, and the fact that the squad has got the sort of shape and dynamic that it has, that we're in the situation where we do have to completely gut the team effectively and not start again, but you're not far off. But I think that, and I think so much it is to do with the mechanisms in place. Villa's owners are incredibly wealthy, right? They have all the money in the world to spend. And when they're not able to, when we're having to scratch around signing Garnacho on loan with a view to buy him next summer, and it's been a constant situation where these types of deals, you had the Harvey Elliott deal last summer, it's been non-stop. And honestly, after year after year after year of it, it gets pretty tiresome. Obviously, when you're selling your Rodgers of the world for 100+ million and you're still having to do these ridiculous other deals to try and, balance the books, when you do see, you see the amount of money other teams are spending is crazy.
yeah. I mean, the problem is when you look at the Abramovich time at Chelsea. Like, I'm writing an article actually for my Substack at the moment about transfers, and I was looking back at some of those transfer windows. Absolutely insane the amounts he was spending. And I'm sure the Villa owners would love to pump in a load of more money on players. The thing is, they're not the only ones, and I think if there weren't restrictions, it just gets crazy. And of course, it's nice from Villa's perspective that you get the wealthy owners, but in an alternative universe, maybe it's Birmingham City or something, and you might feel different about it. So you're right. We
No, but I think what you're asking for is a levelish playing field. And I know revenues has been determined as this is the metric that everything has to be sort of anchored off. But that's been based on you've only been able to build that because you've been in the sort of Champions League for like the last 10, 15 years, or you've got the big new stadium, or that's been a concerted. If it was on things like the financial fair play stuff was originally brought in so teams wouldn't go bust in terms of debts and things like that. Villa are one of the few teams out there with literally no debt because the owners had put the money in. And you have to ask yourself, what is it just feels the whole aim of it is to, I understand why the top 6 teams want to stay where they are. They don't want a Villa or a Newcastle. You said earlier, who would want to see the Saudis come in and spend £2 billion? And, how is that any different to what Man City did or Blackburn back in the day did or any of the, Chelsea did, as you say, under Roman?
Yeah, but I think the point is, if you
who
could wind back the clock, I think a lot of people would prefer that Chelsea hadn't been able to do that and that Man City hadn't been able to do that. Because I think that, personally, I still just find it so boring when Chelsea or Man City win anything. I just find it like a non-event. I don't think it's a story. There's nothing interesting about those clubs, in my opinion. Whereas Arsenal, as much as I dislike them, I think it was more of an interesting story them winning the league after not winning it for 20 years. And even though they spent a lot of money, I just think that it is artificial. You mentioned that word. I think it's artificial when teams do win by just having an owner pumping in crazy amounts of money. And I know you'd love it if Villa kept spending money
no,
and
but
won the league. I
right,
don't
but
think everyone else would find that especially interesting.
yeah, but hold on. Look at Arsenal. Arsenal spent £1 billion under Arteta, right? Now, and I know it's not all about net spend and everything like that. Let's not pretend that's some incredible achievement from Arsenal. I know they've not won it for a long time and the club's run differently to others and everything else. They've spent fortunes to win that title. This is a team who has 2 or 3 players in every position, okay? And I just think it's so hard. If you want a league where you want teams to come up and actually try and challenge and be successful. We are literally in a situation where I think everything that could have gone right for Villa pretty much in these last 3 or 4 years has done under Emery. And it feels like we are so far away from establishing ourselves in terms of as a top 5 or 6 team. So far away because of
Well,
the
yeah, but
way the
I'll go
rules
back to
are
what I
at the
said. Like,
moment.
you were literally in the bottom half of the championship when the owners took over. So the idea that you're complaining that you can't establish yourself as a Big Six club. I mean, well, yeah, because
No, but that's
Villa are
because
not a
no,
big
but
club.
no, but had success on the pitch, right? 4 years where they've qualified for Europe, right? 4 years in a row finished above Spurs, for example, right? And yet couldn't be further away, honestly, this year. We have this crazy situation where Villa finished 4th, Tottenham finished 17th, and everything that's happened off the field means that Tottenham are going into the season as significant favourites over Villa to finish above them. And it's just, I think it's just absolute madness in terms of, obviously, and we're not even going to talk about all the Man City having 115 charges, all the Chelsea stuff where they're not getting punished for all this other stuff. I mean, you see, so I think one of the good things from a Villa perspective is that they've addressed the fact they do need to get younger. And a lot of the signings reflect that. I don't think they necessarily wanted to do what they're doing. I think Tielemans going caught everyone by surprise, to United because it wasn't crazy money, but he was on big wages. And this is one of the problems that Villa have is it's a constant battle between, you're happy to see one of your best players from last year, Tielemans, go because it's going to lower the wage bill. I mean, is that really what football's become from a Villa fan perspective? We're happy to, people weren't bothered about Rodgers leaving overly, but you're happy to, let's talk Emi Martinez, right? Martinez has been as good as any goalkeeper in the Premier League pretty much in the last 5, 6 years. He's been unbelievable for Villa, right? And now looks like he's off and he's been linked with moves away before. But again, people are seemingly happy to take a small transfer fee for him just to get his wages off the books. It just is an incredible situation where none of the other teams are having to get rid of players because they need their wage bill to come down. You look at Manchester City's wage bill, it's pretty double, 250% bigger than, say, Villa's wage bill is. It's just nuts.
Yeah, I mean, clearly the wages being dished out of Villa have been astronomical. I mean, there's a reason why they're facing these restrictions, right? I think all the contracts that have been signed, they've gone into them knowing what they're signing, and that's how they've chosen to do it. They've chosen to give high wages to sort of peak age players instead of going down the sort of cheap, younger, low wages guys. And I mean, it's worked. I just think that, yeah, I understand that you'd love to just keep all the players and invest and add in even more players and get better. I understand that, right? That's what every fan wants. But ultimately, I just don't think you can complain too much. I think that the route that they've gone down of paying, it was more than 100% of the club's revenue at one stage they were paying in wages, which is incredible. I think Spurs were on 40% as a comparison. So, they've been aggressive, and you'd say it's worked. It's resulted in multiple Champions League positions. But now it's like you got to pay the bills, right? You can't sort of have it both ways. They've known exactly what the rules
No,
were,
but
and
but
they've
but this but this is right. But this is where the frustrations come. Is you have so many big teams who haven't had to pay the bills, and I think that's where the frustration comes. Is your Man Uniteds, they're not having to pay the
yeah. I
bills,
mean, so you're
right?
frustrated that you're not Man United. I mean, but that is football.
Well, no. But even like Tottenham, like you guys have spent a fortune, right, in the last 3, 4 years on. There's no consequence to, you're able to go and spend another 250 million or whatever this summer, and I mean, anyway, right?
Yeah,
That's in terms of
we
sort
got
of
to move on. We're losing
individual.
control. So,
Um,
I,
it's just frustrating because it does shape. When we look at the players Villa have had sort of come in, I think we have to start with the outgoings because that is sort of the story of the summer. Really, Rodgers going to Chelsea, record numbers. It's fine. Live with it. I think it's decent business for Villa. I'm not sure Rodgers is quite what people hope he is. We will see. Tielemans going, as I say, was a blow. There's been loads of other business at Villa that was probably passed people by, but the likes of Marlon actually joining Roma. He obviously went there in January, but that deal's now done. Berenchia, who was part of the Douglas Luiz transfer, um, originally, he's now been sold permanently. Same with Lewis Dobbin. He's now gone permanently to Southampton. Digne's obviously left to go to Paris Saint-Germain. Huge wages have come off the books, which I think has been the sort of the aim. We've also had loan players like Harvey Elliott, Jordan Sancho, Douglas Luiz. They've all disappeared. And I think one of the problems is, from a Villa perspective, is they're looking very light on numbers. You know, even if you think about your Douglas Luiz's and Sancho's of the world, is yes, they were on loan last year, big wages, but they were doing they filled a role in terms of the squad. And that would be my one worry from a Villa perspective, is it feels light on quality players, to be honest.
Yeah, and when you start getting a few injuries, right? I mean, obviously Onana's out. That's when it can start getting rough when you don't have the depth and you start getting into positions where you're maybe having to put a youth team player in the side and stuff like that. Um, yeah. So what about transfers in? I think that's always a little bit more
Well,
interesting.
Manzambi was big one. He's obviously injured at the moment, knee injury, ideal. Um, but eh, you know, how good he is or otherwise, we just have to wait and see. He's someone I knew about, as I say, earlier in the year when he was at Freiburg. It's not just a World Cup. I mean, there's nothing more annoying than you hear commentators say, "Oh, he's just Villa have just signed him because he had a good World Cup," and it's like, well, clearly it's not the case.
Speaking
He
of
just
World Cup signings, so what about this goalkeeper Suzuki? What about him?
well, so Suzuki is so this is the big, really breaking story in the last sort of 24 hours, and it had looked like Martinez was going to be um, number one for this season. Obviously, had all the issues last year where it looked like he was going to go to Man United. He said he wanted to go to Man United. It looked like he was leaving, and I think this is what's happened. Is Villa have said enough's enough, and we're in this weird situation now where the Suzuki, we'd been linked with him earlier in the year in this transfer window. It looked like he was going to Paris Saint-Germain, but that sort of collapsed yesterday or on Saturday, and Suzuki is pretty much an Aston Villa player now, and apparently he's there as the number one. Um, because I know Villa had been linked with him. I did sort of keep quite a close eye on him in the World Cup, and he's a big unit. And the more you look into him, he has certain attributes I like. So he likes to come for crosses and some of those sorts of things. There's nothing worse than having a goalkeeper who just stays on his line the whole time. I think certainly in the Premier League, you have to, he's a big, big unit. I mean, look, I don't. We'll have to wait and see. I mean, he's very young. I think I would say the fact that Paris Saint-Germain was so invested in him would be probably a positive sign, even though their last couple of goalkeeping signings haven't been brilliant, in like Chevalier. But all of a sudden, it leaves Villa with an interesting conundrum where Emi Martinez is essentially Villa's number two now. And, I think it's inevitable he will move on, but Villa want some sort of transfer fee for him. And I don't quite know what's happening at Juventus, but it looks like Vicario's going there, so that's off the table. They just clearly weren't willing to pay the money. But I mean, you said to me earlier, who will, where does he go? And it is tricky whether maybe he goes to Saudi, maybe, if I was a Chelsea, I look at Chelsea and I go, getting Martinez in for a couple of seasons, I think would be an unbelievable signing for them. Um, he played at an elite level last year, and he will be a massive miss for Villa. It doesn't matter how good Suzuki is. Villa always had this situation looming where Martinez was going to leave at some point, and it's happened sooner than they would have probably hoped. But, that's football. You have to sort of move on with it. But I don't know where Martinez goes. Maybe he goes to Tottenham, John.
Yeah, I don't see that happening, to be honest with you. But yeah, I think Suzuki, it'll be an interesting one. It's so hard to know how good these players are, of course. But the good thing is with goalkeepers, we've always talked about how it's such an important position. but you still don't really pay the same fees. And so when you look at like Manzambi, for example, paying, I can't remember, is it 60 million euros in the end? It looks like I think Suzuki's going to be probably half of that, right? So at least it's one of those where if he turns out to be no good, it's not a sort of catastrophic mistake, and you can just kind of go after someone else. But yeah, just so many changes and uh,
Well, I think one of the things I've touched before on these podcasts is if you're going to have a season where you blow things up and change things, this is the season to do it. Coventry, Hull, Ipswich are terrible. I mean, Coventry are making some interesting moves. I think out of the three, they're comfortably the best of the three, probably. But this is the year. If Villa, it's why I want them to blow things up now. Is Konza has 2 years left on a deal. He's 29. If a team wants to spend £50 million on him, sell him. I mean, it's the time to do clever business like that. And it's the same with Ollie Watkins. There's been lots of chat in the last couple of days about him potentially going to Saudi. If Saudi come in for him, get rid of him. He is what, 31. You know, there's only so many years you can actually collect a transfer fee for some of these players and actually try and replace them with the money. Like Konza, for example, is if you got £50 million in, you could potentially try and replace him with that money. Leave it till next year when he would have a year left on his contract. You might get, I don't know, 30, 35 million. It gets increasingly difficult to then actually bring in a replacement with that money. And I just feel like this is the time for Villa to go all in, get rid of the elder generation. So they might want to keep the likes of Mings and Barkley around because, as we say, squad numbers are very low and they'll move out next year. But I think this is the time. Blow it all up, sell what needs to be sold, and just have a year where you're giving youngsters more of an opportunity.
one of the players I think is going to be incredibly interesting at Villa this season is Garnacho. And it is interesting. I think sometimes some of his numbers actually look reasonable, even at Chelsea. Um, but I still just can't get past the fact that, well, why have Chelsea got rid of him so quickly after one season? I think that is a concern. So how do you feel about Garnacho?
Well, I think the Chelsea situation is always interesting because I don't think they're a benchmark of like a normal club in terms of their buying and selling. So they're often desperate to balance the books in terms of that they have their own sort of financial fair play issues and cost ratios that they have to hit. So I don't think they're necessarily the benchmark for a normal team. I think Garnacho is obviously he was at United when they were massively dysfunctional as well. So he has been at two very tricky teams. He's not someone I wanted to sign particularly. I'm not going to lie. I don't particularly rate him. I guess we'll just have to. I, I mean, Villa do need extra pace in the team, but he's questionable character as well. I, you have certain transfers over the years where you get this is just disappointing, and this one, he might be a talented youngster. He might sort of tick a lot of boxes from a stats perspective, but there's no getting away from it. This isn't the type of player you want to be signing, but this is also harps back to the first. Villa clearly felt that they didn't have many great options in terms of what they could do this summer in terms of transfers in and out.
So you're telling me you're not going to be ordering your Garnacho Villa shirt next week?
It's all right, John. Already got my Mad Joe shirt on order. One appearance. But I think the one thing about Garnacho is even if he does become permanent, is I think you'll find a team is always willing to take a risk on him because he is so young. So even if Villa did sign him for 40 million and he was a disaster, it always feels like you'd get another team in the Premier League who'd go and spend 30 million on him or something crazy. So I think there is actually a bit of a flaw with that signing. One thing I would say with Emery, maybe Emery's the type of manager he needs who, we've seen Emery like improve. The one thing I'd say about Emery more than anything is he just improves players. So if you look back at when he took over at Villa, that's what's amazing is that 5 or 6 of the team now are the part of the team that he took over from. Your Martinez's, Konzas, and Cashes and McGinns,
Yeah,
Watkins, all these
it doesn't
guys.
reflect well on Steven Gerrard, to be quite honest.
Well, I think, yeah, it's sort of in between. In like Kamara was in under Gerrard, and I think it doesn't reflect well on Gerrard, but I think it also shows you how good Emery is at actually improving players. So you look at someone like McGinn's a great example. He was pretty much dropped when Emery came in, and what Emery's getting out of McGinn now is unbelievable. And it's not as if it's some young kid he's improving. It's an experienced Premier League player that he's just taking to the next level. And it would also be why I'd be really a little bit nervous about signing your Rodgers and your Tielemans of the world. And any team, any player from Villa is that on the flip side to Emery improving players is I suspect some players moving away from an Emery coached team may not be as good as they once were under Emery.
Yeah. So we touched on the goalkeeper situation. So what about Villa's defence? How do you feel overall? It will depend on whether Konsa stays or goes. I'm guessing you're pretty much going to run back the same defence as last year, except without Digne playing left back. Is it Matsson's going to be the starting left back now, would you say?
I think so. Obviously, they signed Ruggieri from Atletico Madrid to be Maatsen and Ruggieri. I think it will depend on opposition. So I think you could see a situation where Ruggieri plays against better teams. Maatsen maybe more useful against low blocks. Maatsen, there is a footballer in there. He just needs to improve his position and defensive work. I quite like Maatsen. I think central defensively, Torres is obviously the key player there. When he's not there, really, really miss him. He's a crucial part of sort of the Emery sort of setup in terms of build-up
Yeah, I'll
play.
just add about Torres. So I did some analysis on my Substack about each team and their most important and worst players from last season in terms of how the team played according to my model. And Pau Torres came out number one for Aston Villa as in terms of just the overall effect when he's starting versus when he's not starting.
Yeah, massively important, and I think that's why I'm not that bothered about Konza. That's Konza. I think is generally probably slightly overrated. One of the worries you have at sort of centre back is the lack of depth. As always, if you get a couple of injuries, Mings, for example, isn't he's not a Premier League starter for a top 6 or 7 team, should we say? He's not good enough anymore. He will be out the club, I think, within the next 12 months. Right back is always interesting, and they've obviously been linked with Wan-Bissaka. I mean, Cash has become a steady, reliable performer in the Premier League. He isn't an elite right back, and you still see him make so many silly errors, and he is a bit of a liability at times. And I'm still amazed. I mean, lack of resources and needs elsewhere that have seen us not upgrade that position. But I don't have any huge hopes for that Villa defense, if I'm honest. As I say, it's very similar to last year. It's not an elite defense. It's solid enough, and a lot of it. I think Villa's really big strength has been central midfield. Under Emery, I'd say goalkeeper and central midfield have been the 2 areas where Villa have had sort of elite performers within them, and I think the central midfield area is just fascinating because I'd have put Villa's central midfielders up against last season, up against almost any other team in the Premier League. Now, you see, obviously, Anana's got injured, Tielemans has left. It's Kamara obviously got injured, had ACL last year. So, I mean, everything that sort of could have gone wrong in that sort of area has, and that would be a bit of a worry, I think, from a Villa
So
perspective.
how would you expect them to line up if everyone's available except for Onana because that's a long term injury? But assuming everyone else is available, what would you expect the starting midfield to be?
Well, I'd expect Gomez and Kamara in the sort of central midfield roles. I would expect at the moment McGinn wide right. You'd expect Manzambi either through the middle or off the left, with probably Buendia in the other position.
Wait. You're
Maybe
saying
Garnacho
Garnacho is not going to be starting?
remains to be seen, John. Remains to be seen. Maybe he has a clause in his contract that means if he plays 3 times, you know, the deal doesn't become the deal becomes permanent, so we won't see him. I I think it really depends on if Watkins is fit or not, because Abraham's injured at the moment as well. So it really depends on the balance. But I think Kamara and Gomez. Gomez, by the way, looks an unbelievable signing.
Yeah,
Everything I've
I
seen
like that signing.
preseason, Premier League ready. I mean, he looks absolute quality. But again, as is always the way, he's injured for the next 2 or 3 weeks.
And talk to me about injuries,
And
Luke.
I think no, but it just the Onana one was a killer. And that's why blowing up the season doesn't feel like a bad idea. Make the changes now. Obviously, next season you get Anana back as well. It's just frustrating because, you know, you have a situation last year where you potentially try and build on something, and then you look at it and it's just decimated. I mean, I don't even know where. I think the one positive is that you saw in the Super Cup was, Villa do have some good youngsters. So yeah, your Hemmings of the world. He looks like he's taken a big step forward from last year. Obviously, Allison fits a sort of another signing in that sort of Duran, um, Rogers mold. That sort of £10 million signing that Villa sometimes make on a
And I think
youngster.
I can
He
guess
struggled.
who's going to be your youngster to watch this season, Luke. Who's it going to be?
Allison. No, no. I mean, but Allison's interesting, right? So young Brazilian, loads of pace. He looks an interesting. What was interesting about him was at the time Villa were linked with Rayan at obviously Bournemouth, and obviously one cost 3 times more, but they were being talked about at the same time. And I think if Villa had really wanted Rayan, they probably could have got him if they had the money and they were willing to spend it. But they went with Allison. Obviously, he's been injured, so we haven't really seen him. Whereas Rayan's been unbelievable for Bournemouth.
Well, it is interesting with
So
Brazilians now because you look at how much it costs to go to the likes of Liga and the Bundesliga. You're paying sometimes like 60 odd million just to get someone who's had like one decent season in those leagues. So increasingly, you're seeing now Premier League teams just going straight to the source in South America. Years ago, they all used to sort of end up in Portugal, didn't they? You'd have Brazilians they'd move to Portugal because of visa reasons. And then Premier League teams then would buy them for huge money. So I think it is quite interesting. You see the changes over times in terms of which markets are maybe good value or bad value, and there's never a shortage of decent Brazilian footballers in the world. So I think it is maybe a sensible idea to be going there and picking up promising youngsters.
So I think that's going to be interesting, in terms of how much playing time he gets, how much Hemmings gets. And then, as you were touching on, the youngster to watch has to be Maggio, 17. I mean, we talked about him a few weeks ago before the Super Cup game. And what we talked about was a 17-year-old who's ready to actually play at the highest level. Who knows how switched on Paris Saint-Germain were or weren't, but he was up against sort of world-class centre-backs, and he bullied them a little bit. And I think that's what's really impressive is it's not a case of a 17-year-old kid bullying his age group where you think, oh, these are players who are going to get bigger and stronger. He's doing it against grown men. And I think what was interesting was the number of chances he sort of creates himself. It's quite weird that his strength just gets him into positions that are very, very dangerous. And obviously he's injured as well now.
It was impressive though, and I think having 6 shots in the first half, and I looked into it, there was only one player in the whole of last season in the Premier League who had 6 shots in the first half of a match. So just that gives you an idea of how unusual it is to have 6 shots. And I think sometimes in football, people think that the forward's job is to finish the chances, right? That it's everyone else should create them for the forward. But I think increasingly people are understanding that the actual creation of the shots in the first place is mostly down to the forward with their movement, certainly with their strength. When it comes down to Maggio, he's absolutely enormous. So a very impressive debut, and he's going to be a fascinating player to watch.
Well, I think he'll be super interesting, and I think that's what sort of gives you hope as a Villa fan is that you're going from one extreme, this old experienced team, and suddenly you've almost gone the completely the other way. And I hope that your Majos, and as I say, if Watkins left, my 10-year-old might be sad, but I wouldn't be overly sad if it meant that Maggio actually got a proper run at things. If we can bump up that transfer fee for 150 million when he inevitably gets sold next summer.
Yeah, I mean, let's see. There's still a couple of weeks left of the window, Luke. Maybe Chelsea might slap in a bid for Maggio before the month finishes.
So just in terms of expectations for season, very low, and I don't think they it gets to a point where honestly, if we reset the whole PSR thing with Europe, so we come out of that agreement, which looks like means next time we're in Europe we don't have to abide by their restrictive rules. Even if we don't make Europe next season, I can live with it as long as there's nothing silly in terms of relegations. For me, go super low, like in terms of super young, not low, super young in terms of the group, and get the wage bill massively down, and give Emery the keys to the kingdom as always, and just trust him. I mean, how can you not?
Yeah, absolutely, and it does. It means you have to be smart with these restrictions, and it's so hard to keep a good team together because this is what happens. You got peak age players, you're giving them new contracts, and the wages are high and everything, and clearly one way or another, this Villa side is coming to the end of its cycle, right? When you've got Watkins, Martinez, in their 30s, McGinn. So yeah, a rebuild is required, and I think it's just managing the rebuild, right? That's the one danger. If you try and do it all in one go, it can get a little bit out of control if you end up with no leaders and stuff. So I think it'd be nice. Still got McGinn around. I think he's just such a good influence on the younger players coming in, and yeah, it's gonna be a fascinating season to watch. That's for sure.
I know it sounds a little bit depressing, but honestly, as a Villa fan, been 4 amazing years, and actually, I think the future, as long as Emery's there, looks bright. Even despite all the, you know, disappointments that people will be feeling at the moment.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's great times. You were in the championship a few years ago. I think people just need to retain that perspective. And I understand, of course, if the situation was reversed, I'm sure I'd be complaining about the same things as you because we're fans, right? That's kind of how it is. But I think you just have to just think back of some of the absolute dross you were watching a few years ago and some of the horrendous players that were putting on the Villa shirt. And it's absolutely just different levels that you're playing at now. And so always just worth bearing that in mind and just trying to enjoy everything.
And can I just say, John, surely Spurs can't finish below Villa again. Everything has gone on. Surely not, John.
Well, let's just once again remind you that Spurs definitely would not be finishing above Villa this year if Villa had just got a draw against Spurs at the end of last season and relegated us to the Championship. So thank you once again for those 3 points that saved Tottenham Hotspur Football Club. And I want all Villa fans, when they're complaining about how much Spurs are spending, I just want you to remember that you could have stopped all that by relegating us, and you didn't. So it's a shame.
Imagine having that fan base crying about relegation with Arsenal winning trophies as well. I mean,
Dark times.
um, dark times. But right, we'll wrap it up there because I know you have to go to work. I will do a Liverpool one with James in midweek, and then we'll do on Friday. We'll do something looking ahead to the season in terms of other teams and sort of expectations for them. But thank you, John, and we will catch up soon.
Yeah, thanks, mate. Shame James couldn't be here, but I'm looking forward to the Liverpool one. That'll be good.
Honestly, he's just going to moan and moan and moan.
I expect nothing else.
All right, mate. All right. Thank
Cheers.
you.